The winter of 1834 had been the harshest in living memory across the Austrian Empire, and the frozen Danube stretched like a silver highway between the snow-laden banks near the village of Königswald. Lady Seraphina Ashford picked her way carefully across the treacherous ice, her thin travelling boots providing little purchase on the slick surface as she clutched a leather satchel containing the last remnants of her former life. Behind her, the spires of Castle Ravenstein pierced the pewter sky like accusations against heaven itself. She had fled the fortress before dawn, escaping through a servant's passage she had discovered during her 3 months of captivity, disguised as honoured guest. But Count Victor von Ravenstein's hospitality had been a gilded cage, and his patience with her continued refusal of his marriage proposal had finally reached its end. The crack beneath her feet was as sharp as breaking glass, but Seraphina barely had time to register the sound before the ice gave way completely. The frozen river swallowed her with shocking violence, the black water closing over her head like a liquid tomb. Her heavy winter cloak, sodden within seconds, dragged her down into the merciless current that flowed swift and deadly beneath its deceptive frozen surface. Seraphina had been the toast of Vienna's social season just 18 months ago, her beauty and intelligence making her the target of countless suitors and the envy of mothers whose own daughters paled in comparison. Born to the Earl of Ashford, she had grown up in England's countryside before being sent to the Austrian court to expand her education and perhaps make an advantageous marriage that would strengthen her family's diplomatic connections. But Vienna's glittering ballrooms had proven more dangerous than any battlefield. Her father's sudden death from fever had left her stranded at court without protection or adequate funds, dependent upon the charity of family friends who had their own agendas. When Count Victor had offered his protection, it had seemed like salvation, a wealthy, titled gentleman offering shelter to a young woman in distress. The reality had been far more sinister. Count Victor's protection came with expectations that grew more explicit with each passing week. He wanted a wife, but more than that, he wanted possession, complete control over a beautiful woman who would grace his table, bear his heirs, and never question his authority. Seraphina's refusal to accept his proposal had transformed his courtly courtesy into barely concealed threat. Now as the icy water filled her lungs and her desperate struggle carried her deeper beneath the ice, Seraphina realized that her escape attempt had merely traded one form of death for another. The current was impossibly strong, and her waterlogged clothing made every movement a Herculean effort. Above her, the ice that had broken to admit her passage had already begun to refreeze, sealing her beneath a crystalline ceiling that reflected her failing attempts to break through. Her vision was beginning to grey at the edges when she heard it, a sound like thunder, but rhythmic and purposeful. Something was striking the ice above her with tremendous force, each blow sending spiderweb cracks racing across the frozen surface. Through the distorted lens of water and ice, she could see a dark figure working with desperate intensity to reach her. Prince Alexander Thornfield had been riding hard from Vienna, carrying urgent dispatches from the imperial court to his regiment stationed near the Bavarian border. His mission was diplomatic as much as military. Tensions with Prussia were escalating, and experienced commanders were needed to assess defensive positions along the disputed frontier. The prince had earned his reputation through merit rather than birth, his tactical brilliance having saved Austrian forces during the Italian campaigns of the previous decade. Though second son to the Duke of Thornfield, he had chosen military service over court life, finding purpose in defending the realm rather than pursuing the privileges of noble blood. His sharp eyes had caught the movement on the ice just as the surface gave way, and without hesitation he had spurred his horse toward the disaster unfolding before him. Some instinct, perhaps honed by years of split-second battlefield decisions, told him that this was no accidental fall. The lone figure had been moving with too much purpose, too much desperation, to be a casual traveler caught by treacherous conditions. Prince Alexander threw himself from his horse before the animal had fully stopped, his military training taking over as he assessed the tactical situation with practiced efficiency. The ice was thick enough to support his weight near the shore, but the section where the woman had fallen through was already beginning to refreeze. In minutes, any chance of rescue would be lost. Without regard for his own safety, the prince began striking the ice with the pommel of his sword, the heavy gold and steel crashing against the frozen surface with methodical precision. Each blow sent shock waves through his arms, but he continued with the relentless determination that had made him legendary among his troops. The ice was thicker than it appeared, and Prince Alexander realized that his sword alone would not be sufficient. Casting aside both weapon and discretion, he began attacking the frozen barrier with his bare fists, ignoring the way the jagged edges tore at his gloves and the skin beneath. Blood began to stain the white surface, but still he continued, driven by a desperation he couldn't quite understand. There was something about the brief glimpse he had caught of the falling woman, her grace even in disaster, the way she had clutched that leather satchel as if it contained everything she valued in the world, that had struck him with unexpected force. This was not just any drowning victim. This was someone whose loss would diminish the world in ways he could not articulate. As the ice finally began to give way beneath his assault, Prince Alexander saw a pale hand appear in the dark water below. Without hesitation, he plunged his own arm through the jagged opening, ignoring the shock of the frigid water as he groped for contact with the drowning woman. Serafina felt strong fingers close around her wrist, just as consciousness began to slip away. The grip was sure and powerful, belonging to someone who would not let her go regardless of the cost to himself. With the last of her strength, she grasped the offered lifeline and felt herself being pulled upward through the killing water, toward the light that filtered down through broken ice. Prince Alexander hauled her from the river, with the controlled strength of a man accustomed to impossible physical demands. As he lifted her clear of the water, he got his first clear look at the woman he had rescued, and the sight struck him with unexpected force. Even sodden and half-drowned, she was extraordinary. Her platinum hair hung in wet ribbons around a face that belonged in Renaissance paintings, and her blue eyes, when they finally focused on his, held an intelligence and spirit that had not been quenched even by her near-death experience. This was no helpless maiden despite her current circumstances. "Can you hear me?" Prince Alexander asked, supporting her weight as she struggled to find her footing on the treacherous ice. "Yes," Serafina managed, though her voice was barely a whisper through chattering teeth. "Thank you. I thought, don't think about what might have been," Prince Alexander interrupted gently. "Think about getting warm and dry before hypothermia sets in." He shrugged out of his heavy traveling coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, the garment's warmth and the scent of leather and sandalwood providing an anchor to consciousness as her body tried to shut down from cold and shock. "My horse is just there," he continued, supporting her as they made their way carefully toward shore. "I have a camp nearby with a fire and supplies. Can you manage a short ride?" Serafina nodded, though she wasn't certain her legs would support her weight much longer. As Prince Alexander lifted her onto his horse and swung up behind her, she realized that her mysterious rescuer was clearly a gentleman of quality. His clothing, his bearing, and the casual authority with which he took command of the situation all spoke to breeding and education. "What were you doing on the ice?" he asked, as they rode toward a copse of trees where smoke could be seen rising from a concealed campsite. The question was reasonable, but Serafina found herself reluctant to explain the circumstances that had driven her onto the frozen river. How could she tell this stranger that she was fleeing an unwanted marriage, that she had been essentially imprisoned by a man who believed her refusal was merely feminine coquetry to be overcome through persistence? "I was traveling," she said finally, the half-truth easier than full explanation. The ice seemed safer than the roads. Prince Alexander accepted the evasion without comment, though his military training made him alert to the things she was not saying. A young woman of obvious quality, traveling alone in winter without proper escort or equipment, suggested circumstances that were either desperate or scandalous. Either way, she would need protection until a more permanent solution could be arranged. As they reached his camp, a professional military arrangement with picketed horses, weatherproof shelters, and a well-banked fire, Prince Alexander realized that his mission to the frontier would now include an unexpected complication. But looking down at the woman whose life he had literally pulled from the jaws of death, he found himself oddly grateful for whatever twist of fate had brought them together. What he didn't know was that Lady Serafina Ashford's rescue would prove to be far more than a chance encounter. It would be the beginning of a love story that would challenge everything both of them believed about duty, honor, and the price of choosing heart over obligation. Prince Alexander's camp was a study in military precision. 2 canvas pavilions arranged to shelter the fire from wind, provisions stored in waterproof containers, and equipment organized with the systematic efficiency of someone who had campaigned in hostile territory. His aide-de-camp, Sergeant Major Willem Kraus, emerged from one of the tents as they approached, his weathered face immediately assessing the situation with professional competence. Your Highness, Kraus said, moving to assist with their unexpected guest. The lady appears in need of immediate attention. Hypothermia and shock, Prince Alexander replied tersely, as he dismounted and lifted Serafina down. Prepare the medical kit and heat water for tea. We'll need dry clothing and warm blankets. As Serafina was settled near the fire, her rescue began to feel surreal. The warmth gradually penetrated her frozen limbs, but with returning sensation came the full realization of how close she had come to death. The leather satchel she had somehow managed to retain throughout her ordeal lay beside her, water still dripping from its edges. You should remove those wet clothes, Prince Alexander said gently, offering her a heavy military blanket. Sergeant Major Kraus can arrange privacy while you change. The practical necessity warred with Serafina's ingrained modesty, but survival won out over propriety. Within the sheltered space of one pavilion, she stripped off her sodden garments and wrapped herself in the blessed warmth of dry wool. Her fingers, still clumsy from cold, struggled with the simple task of securing the blanket. When she emerged, Prince Alexander had changed into dry clothing himself and was preparing tea over the fire. His hands, she noticed, were bandaged where the ice had torn at them during his desperate rescue efforts. The sight of his injuries, sustained for her sake, filled her with a complicated mixture of gratitude and guilt. You're hurt, she observed, settling carefully on the camp chair Kraus had positioned near the fire. Nothing serious, Prince Alexander replied, though the bandages suggested otherwise. Kraus has dealt with far worse injuries from training accidents. Sergeant Major Kraus approached with a steaming mug, his expression professionally neutral but his eyes kind. Drink slowly, miss, he advised. Your body needs to warm gradually. As the hot tea began to restore feeling to her extremities, Serafina became aware of the curious position she now occupied. She was essentially alone with two military men, wearing nothing but a blanket, miles from any settlement that might offer proper chaperoning. In normal circumstances, such a situation would be scandalous beyond repair. But these were hardly normal circumstances, and the man who had risked his life to save her seemed to possess the kind of honor that made propriety concerns feel petty and irrelevant. I should introduce myself properly, Prince Alexander said, settling across from her with his own tea. Prince Alexander Thornfield of the Austrian Imperial Guard. And you are? The moment of revelation had arrived, and with it the need to decide how much truth to share. Serafina had been living under an assumed name at Count Victor's castle, but something about Prince Alexander's direct gaze made deception feel both impossible and unnecessary. Lady Serafina Ashford, she replied, daughter of the late Earl of Ashford, recently of Vienna and currently of nowhere in particular. Prince Alexander's eyebrows rose slightly at the revelation of her nobility, but his expression remained carefully neutral. Lady Ashford, I believe I may have heard your father mentioned in diplomatic circles. His death was a significant loss to Anglo-Austrian relations. You knew of my father? Serafina asked, surprised by the unexpected connection. By reputation only, but it was an excellent reputation. His work in negotiating the trade agreements of 31 was particularly admired by my superiors. Prince Alexander studied her face with growing concern. Which makes your current circumstances all the more puzzling. Surely your father's connections would have provided for your protection after his death. The question touched the heart of Serafina's predicament. My father's death left me in a rather complicated position, she said carefully. I was in Vienna for educational purposes. When he passed, the distance made immediate return to England impractical, and certain parties offered assistance that proved to have unexpected conditions attached. Prince Alexander's military mind immediately grasped the implications of her careful phrasing. A young woman of quality, stranded far from home and dependent upon the charity of strangers, would be vulnerable to exploitation by anyone with sufficient influence and flexible morals. Count Victor von Ravenstein by any chance? He asked quietly. Serafina's start of surprise confirmed his suspicion. You know the Count? I know his reputation, Prince Alexander replied grimly. Victor von Ravenstein collects beautiful things, art, jewels, women. He's known for his persistent courtship of ladies who find themselves without adequate protection. The way he said courtship made it clear that Prince Alexander understood the true nature of Count Victor's interest. Serafina felt a flush of shame at having her situation so clearly comprehended, but also relief at not having to explain the increasingly uncomfortable months she had spent as the Count's guest. I refused his proposal of marriage, she said quietly. He disagreed with my decision and made it clear that my continued residence at his castle was contingent upon my eventual acceptance of his suit. So, you chose to flee rather than submit, Prince Alexander concluded. The ice seemed preferable to his continued hospitality. When you phrase it that way, it sounds rather melodramatic, Serafina said with a weak smile. It sounds brave, Prince Alexander corrected firmly. Many women in your position would have accepted security over freedom. Sergeant Major Kraus approached the fire with obvious reluctance to interrupt. Begging your pardon, Your Highness, but there are riders approaching, multiple horses moving at speed. Prince Alexander was on his feet immediately, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. How many? 6 or 8, sir. They'll be here within minutes. Serafina's blood ran cold. Count Victor had clearly discovered her escape more quickly than she had hoped, and his pursuit had been swift and determined. The sanctuary she had found in Prince Alexander's camp was about to be shattered. It's him, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Count Victor. He's found me. Prince Alexander's expression hardened into something that reminded Serafina that this man was not merely a courtly gentleman, but a battle-tested military commander. Kraus, full kit, swords and pistols. Sir, the sergeant major acknowledged, disappearing into the equipment tent with practiced efficiency. Lady Ashford, Prince Alexander said, turning to face her with calm authority, you have a choice to make. You can allow Count Victor to escort you back to his castle, or you can accept my protection and the complications that such protection might entail. What complications? Serafina asked, though she suspected she already knew. Count Victor will not accept my interference in what he considers his rightful pursuit. This could easily escalate into a matter of honor that would require decisive resolution. The euphemism was clear. Prince Alexander was offering to fight for her, but such a fight would likely end in death for one of them. The thought of this honorable man risking his life for her sake was both thrilling and terrifying. I cannot ask you to, she began, but Prince Alexander cut her off with a gesture. You're not asking, I'm offering, but the choice must be yours. The sound of approaching hoofbeats was growing louder, and Serafina realized that her moment of decision had arrived. She could return to Count Victor's golden cage and eventually submit to his demands, or she could accept Prince Alexander's protection and drag him into a conflict that was not his responsibility. But as she looked at the man who had literally broken through ice with his bare hands to save her life, Serafina realized that her choice had already been made. Some risks were worth taking, especially when the alternative was a lifetime of regret. I accept your protection, she said clearly, and whatever consequences may follow. Prince Alexander nodded once, sharply, then turned to face the direction of the approaching riders. When Sergeant Major Kraus emerged from the tent with weapons and equipment, the camp had been transformed from peaceful sanctuary into potential battlefield. Remember, Prince Alexander said quietly to Serafina as the first horses became visible through the trees, whatever happens next, you are under my protection. Count Victor has no authority over you while you remain in my care. And if he disagrees with that assessment? Serafina asked. Prince Alexander's smile was sharp as a blade's edge. Then he'll discover what it means to challenge the Imperial Guard. Count Victor von Ravenstein emerged from the winter forest like an avenging demon, his black stallion's breath creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air as he surveyed Prince Alexander's camp with cold calculation. Behind him rode 6 men-at-arms bearing his colors, their weapons clearly visible and their intentions unmistakable. The Count was a man of considerable presence, tall, silver-haired, and possessed of the kind of aristocratic bearing that spoke to centuries of noble breeding. His pale blue eyes held the merciless intelligence of someone accustomed to getting his way through whatever means proved necessary, and his smile as he spotted Serafina was both triumphant and predatory. Lady Ashford, he called out, dismounting with fluid grace, you have led us quite a chase, my dear. I trust your morning constitutional was refreshing, despite its unfortunate conclusion. Prince Alexander stepped forward, placing himself deliberately between Count Victor and Serafina. Count von Ravenstein, I presume. I am Prince Alexander Thornfield. The lady is currently under my protection. Ah, Prince Thornfield, Count Victor replied with mock courtesy. How fortuitous that you happened to be in the area when my ward met with her accident. I am, of course, deeply grateful for your assistance in rescuing her from the river. The way he emphasized ward made it clear that he considered his claim on Serafina to be legal, as well as personal. Prince Alexander, however, was not intimidated by semantic manipulation. Lady Ashford is not your ward, he said calmly. "She is a free woman of noble birth who has the right to choose her own associations." "How charmingly naive," Count Victor laughed, though his eyes remained cold as winter steel. "Perhaps your highness is unaware that Lady Ashford has been residing at my castle for several months as my honored guest. Her departure this morning was precipitous and undertaken without proper consideration for her safety or the proprieties." "Her departure was voluntary," Prince Alexander replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "As was her decision to accept my protection rather than return to your hospitality." Count Victor's facade of civility began to crack. "Your Highness, while I appreciate your noble intentions, you clearly do not understand the situation. Lady Ashford is not stable in her judgment. The shock of her father's death, combined with the stresses of being alone in a foreign country, has affected her mental capacity. She requires guidance and protection that only a properly established household can provide." The accusation of mental instability was a common tactic used against women who refused to submit to male authority, and Prince Alexander recognized it immediately for what it was: a legal fiction designed to override Serafina's right to self-determination. "I find Lady Ashford's judgment to be perfectly sound," Prince Alexander said, his tone growing dangerously quiet. "Sound enough to recognize when hospitality has become imprisonment." "Imprisonment?" Count Victor's voice rose with apparent indignation. "Your Highness, surely you don't credit such melodramatic nonsense. The lady has been free to come and go as she pleased, within reasonable limits for her own safety." "Then you won't object to her continuing to exercise that freedom," Prince Alexander replied smoothly. Serafina watched the verbal duel with growing anxiety. Count Victor was clearly building towards some decisive action, and she could see the way his men-at-arms were positioning themselves to surround the camp. Prince Alexander and Sergeant Major Kraus were formidable, but they were outnumbered 3-1. "Your Highness," Count Victor said, his voice now carrying open threat, "I fear you have been deceived about Lady Ashford's circumstances. Perhaps this document will clarify the situation." He withdrew a legal paper from his coat, the official seals immediately visible even at a distance. "A formal petition to the Imperial Court, naming me as Lady Ashford's legal guardian due to her diminished mental capacity and lack of male relatives to provide proper guidance. The petition has been approved and sealed by the appropriate authorities." Prince Alexander accepted the document with apparent calm, though Serafina could see the tension in his shoulders as he read. Legal guardianship would give Count Victor absolute authority over her person and property, reducing her to the status of a child, regardless of her actual age or competence. "An impressive forgery," Prince Alexander said finally, returning the paper with casual contempt, "but ultimately irrelevant." "Forgery?" Count Victor sputtered with what appeared to be genuine outrage. "Your Highness, that document bears the imperial seal and the signature of officials who have never met Lady Ashford and who based their decision entirely on your own testimony," Prince Alexander interrupted. "Testimony which, as I have observed personally, bears no resemblance to reality." Count Victor's mask of civility finally fell away completely. "Your Highness, you are interfering in matters that do not concern you. I strongly advise you to step aside and allow me to escort Lady Ashford back to her proper place. And if I refuse, then I shall be forced to conclude that you are not acting in the lady's best interests, but rather seeking to exploit her vulnerable condition for your own purposes." Count Victor's hand moved to his sword hilt. "A conclusion that would require me to take immediate action to protect her virtue and reputation." The threat was clear. Count Victor was prepared to characterize Prince Alexander's protection as an abduction with dishonorable intent, justifying whatever violence might follow. It was a clever strategy, one that would allow him to eliminate a rival while claiming to defend Serafina's honor. "Otto," Count Victor called to his captain of guards, "prepare to escort Lady Ashford to safety. Use whatever force proves necessary to overcome any resistance." Prince Alexander's sword was in his hand before Count Victor finished speaking, the blade singing as it cleared its scabbard. Sergeant Major Kraus moved to flank his commander, his own weapons ready, though the odds remained daunting. "Lady Ashford," Prince Alexander said without taking his eyes off Count Victor, "you should move away from the fire. Things are about to become unpleasant." But before anyone could advance or retreat, a new voice cut through the tense silence. "I think not." From the far side of the camp, where the morning shadows remained deep, stepped a figure that made everyone freeze in recognition. Field Marshal von Habsburg, commander of the Imperial Guard and one of the most powerful men in the Austrian Empire, emerged from concealment with 6 elite guardsmen at his back. Prince Alexander's surprise was evident, but he maintained his ready stance. "Field Marshal, your presence is unexpected." "Is it?" The Field Marshal replied with a slight smile. "I've been tracking Count von Ravenstein's activities for several weeks now. His methods of acquiring wives have become a source of concern to certain parties at court." Count Victor's face went pale. "Field Marshal, surely you cannot credit the wild accusations of a hysterical woman." "I credit the testimony of 3 other young ladies who have come forward to describe remarkably similar experiences as guests at your castle," the Field Marshal interrupted. "Lady Ashford's case simply happens to be the most recent and the most thoroughly documented." The revelations struck like lightning. Serafina was not Count Victor's first victim, merely his most recent target in a systematic campaign of exploiting vulnerable women. The knowledge filled her with rage on behalf of those who had not been fortunate enough to escape. "This is preposterous," Count Victor protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I am a peer of the realm, a man of unquestionable reputation. You are a predator who has hidden behind noble privilege for far too long," the Field Marshal said with cold finality. "Count Victor von Ravenstein, by order of His Imperial Majesty, you are under arrest for kidnapping, extortion, and abuse of guardianship laws." As the Imperial Guards moved to surround Count Victor and his men, Prince Alexander lowered his sword, but remained alert. The immediate danger had passed, but the larger implications of the morning's events were only beginning to unfold. "Lady Ashford," the Field Marshal said, approaching with respectful courtesy, "His Majesty extends his formal apologies for the treatment you have suffered while under the protection of the Imperial Court. Steps will be taken to ensure that your safety and dignity are preserved, while permanent arrangements are made for your future." Serafina felt relief wash over her like warm water, but alongside it came uncertainty about what those permanent arrangements might entail. She had escaped Count Victor's control, but she was still a woman alone in a foreign country without family or resources. "Field Marshal," Prince Alexander said quietly, "perhaps we might discuss Lady Ashford's situation privately. I may have a proposal that would address both her immediate needs and her long-term security." As Count Victor was led away under guard, his dreams of forcing Serafina into marriage destroyed forever, she found herself facing a new crossroads. The man who had literally broken through ice to save her life was now offering to help reshape her entire future. The question was whether she possessed the courage to accept a destiny that seemed too wonderful to believe. The Field Marshal's private pavilion served as an impromptu council chamber where Serafina's future would be decided. She sat quietly beside the brazier that warmed the space, still wrapped in Prince Alexander's military blanket, listening as 2 of the most powerful men in the Austrian Empire debated her circumstances with the casual authority of those accustomed to shaping destinies. "The immediate problem," Field Marshal von Habsburg explained, "is that Lady Ashford's position remains legally precarious. Count Victor's guardianship papers were fraudulent, yes, but that leaves her without any recognized protector under imperial law." "What about the English embassy?" Prince Alexander asked. "Surely they have responsibility for British subjects in distress." "The embassy's position is complicated by her father's diplomatic status," the Field Marshal replied grimly. "Earl Ashford's work created certain sensitivities regarding British interference in Austrian internal affairs. They're reluctant to assert jurisdiction over his daughter without explicit instructions from London." Serafina spoke for the first time in the lengthy discussion. "How long would such instructions take to obtain?" "Months, possibly longer," the Field Marshal admitted. "International diplomatic correspondence moves slowly, especially during winter when mountain passes are often impassable." The reality of her situation settled over Serafina like a cold shroud. She had escaped Count Victor's control, but she remained trapped in legal limbo, too valuable to ignore, too vulnerable to abandon, too foreign to fully protect under Austrian law. "There is another option," Prince Alexander said carefully, "one that would provide immediate protection and legal status while preserving Lady Ashford's honor and autonomy." Both the Field Marshal and Serafina looked at him expectantly. "Marriage," Prince Alexander continued, "to an Austrian subject of sufficient rank to ensure her protection and social standing." The suggestion hung in the air like an unspoken proposal, though Prince Alexander's careful phrasing made it clear he was speaking theoretically rather than personally. "An arranged marriage?" Serafina asked, though she suspected she knew where the conversation was heading. A marriage of mutual benefit, Prince Alexander corrected, between parties who respect each other's circumstances and could provide each other with advantages that neither could achieve alone. Field Marshal von Habsburg leaned back in his chair, studying both young people with the shrewd assessment of someone who had navigated court politics for decades. Prince Alexander, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I'm suggesting that Lady Ashford and I might find our situations complementary, Prince Alexander replied formally. She requires protection and social position. I require a wife whose intelligence and character would be an asset to my military and diplomatic career. Serafina stared at him in shock. This was the second marriage proposal she had received in as many days, but the contrast between Prince Alexander's respectful offer and Count Victor's entitled demands could not have been more stark. Your Highness, she said carefully, while I am deeply honored by your consideration, surely such a momentous decision requires more than practical convenience. Does it? Prince Alexander asked, meeting her gaze directly. Most marriages among our class are arrangements based on mutual advantage. The difference is that I'm asking for your consent rather than assuming your compliance. The distinction was crucial. Where Count Victor had sought to coerce her submission, Prince Alexander was offering partnership, but Serafina had dreamed of more than mere convenience in marriage, even as she recognized the reality that her circumstances might require compromise. What exactly would such an arrangement entail, she asked. A marriage that would give you immediate legal protection and social standing as a princess of the Austrian Empire, Prince Alexander explained. You would have your own household, your own income, and the freedom to pursue whatever interests and activities appealed to you. And in return, you would serve as my hostess for official functions, provide the social presence that my military career requires, and, he paused, choosing his words carefully, share my name and my protection for as long as both of us found the arrangement beneficial. Field Marshal von Habsburg cleared his throat. Prince Alexander, are you proposing a marriage in name only? I'm proposing a marriage based on mutual respect and shared goals, Prince Alexander replied. What develops beyond that would be a matter for the future to determine. Serafina appreciated his delicacy in not making physical demands an explicit condition of his offer, but she also understood the implications of what he was proposing. This would be a real marriage with real expectations, even if those expectations were more flexible than traditional arrangements. Field Marshal, she said, what would happen if I chose to wait for word from England rather than accepting Prince Alexander's generous offer? You would remain under court protection, but in an uncertain status that could change with political circumstances, he replied honestly. Count Victor has allies who might continue his campaign against you through legal means. Marriage to Prince Alexander would make such attacks impossible. The practical argument was compelling, but Serafina found herself thinking about the man who had risked his life to save her from the frozen river. Prince Alexander had shown her nothing but honor and respect, qualities that had been conspicuously absent from Count Victor's treatment. If she had to marry for protection, she could hardly hope for a better husband than the one fate had provided. Prince Alexander, she said quietly, may I ask you a personal question? Of course. Why are you making this offer? You could have any woman at court. Why propose marriage to someone you've known for barely a day? Prince Alexander was silent for a long moment, his green eyes reflecting thoughts she could not read. Because in the brief time I've known you, you've shown more courage and integrity than most people display in a lifetime. Because I believe we could build something worthwhile together. And because, he paused, then continued with surprising honesty, because I find myself reluctant to imagine my future without you in it. The admission sent warmth through Serafina that had nothing to do with the brazier's heat. This was not just a proposal of convenience. There were genuine feelings beneath Prince Alexander's formal offer. You said our situations were complementary, she observed. What difficulties in your own circumstances would marriage to me resolve? Prince Alexander exchanged a glance with the Field Marshal, who nodded encouragingly. My military career has reached the point where advancement requires political connections that I've neglected in favor of field service, Prince Alexander explained. A wife with diplomatic experience and social graces would be invaluable in navigating court society. More than that, I need someone I can trust completely, someone whose loyalty isn't based on personal gain or family advancement. And you believe you could trust me? I believe, Prince Alexander said simply, that you are exactly what I've been searching for without realizing it. Serafina felt her heart racing as she considered the magnitude of the decision before her. Marriage to Prince Alexander would solve her immediate problems, while offering possibilities she had never dared consider. But it would also commit her to a life with a man she barely knew, regardless of how honorable he appeared. "I need time to think," she said finally. "How much time?" Field Marshal von Habsburg asked. "Count Victor's arrest has created political complications that need to be resolved quickly. His allies will demand explanations, and your status needs to be clarified before they can mount any legal challenges." "A day," Serafina said. "Give me until tomorrow morning to decide." "Done," Prince Alexander agreed immediately. "Take whatever time you need. This decision will affect both our lives permanently. It shouldn't be made hastily." As the meeting concluded and arrangements were made for Serafina's accommodation under military protection, she found herself facing the most important choice of her life. Marriage to Prince Alexander offered security, status, and the companionship of a man she already respected and was beginning to care for deeply. But it also meant abandoning any dreams of romantic love in favor of practical partnership, no matter how promising that partnership might prove to be. The question was whether she possessed the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most practical choices could also be the most magical ones. Dawn brought no clarity to Serafina's turmoil of emotions, only the knowledge that her decision could no longer be postponed. She had spent the night in quarters provided by the Imperial Guard, her sleep troubled by dreams that alternated between the terror of drowning beneath the ice and the surprising warmth of Prince Alexander's arms, carrying her to safety. The leather satchel that had somehow survived her ordeal sat on the small table beside her bed, its contents now dry but forever changed by their immersion in the Danube. Inside were the few precious items she had managed to salvage from her father's estate: his signet ring, her mother's prayer book, and a miniature portrait of her parents on their wedding day. Looking at that portrait now, she wondered if they had married for love or convenience, and whether the distinction mattered as much as she had always believed. A soft knock interrupted her contemplations. "Lady Ashford," came Prince Alexander's voice through the door. "Might I speak with you before you make your final decision?" She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Her own clothes had been cleaned and dried overnight, and opened the door to find Prince Alexander looking surprisingly uncertain for a man accustomed to command. "Of course, Your Highness, please come in." "Alexander," he corrected gently, "given the nature of our potential relationship, perhaps we might dispense with formal titles when we're alone." The small intimacy of using his given name felt both natural and terrifying. Serafina gestured for him to take the room's single chair, while she settled on the edge of the bed, maintaining proper distance despite the unusual circumstances. "I wanted to ensure that you understand," Alexander began, "that whatever you decide this morning, you will have my protection and assistance. Marriage is not the only way I can help secure your future." The assurance touched her deeply, confirming what she had already begun to suspect, that Alexander's proposal came from genuine concern for her welfare rather than mere convenience. "What alternatives do you envision?" she asked. "I have connections in London who could arrange for your safe passage to England and assistance in reclaiming your inheritance. Or if you prefer to remain in Austria, I could arrange a position as companion to one of the court ladies, someone who would value your education and treat you as family rather than servant." The options he outlined were generous and practical, offering her independence without the complications that marriage would bring. Yet as Serafina considered them, she realized that none of them appealed to her as much as the possibility of sharing a life with the man who sat before her. "Alexander," she said carefully, "may I ask you something that might be considered impertinent? After yesterday's adventures, I think we're well beyond the boundaries of conventional propriety," he replied with a slight smile. "Do you believe it's possible for love to develop within a marriage that begins as an arrangement of convenience?" Alexander considered her question seriously. "I believe it's not only possible but probable when the parties involved are well suited and committed to building something meaningful together." "And do you think we are well suited?" "I think," Alexander said slowly, "that in the brief time I've known you, I've seen qualities that I greatly admire. Your courage in escaping Count Victor, your dignity in the face of impossible circumstances, your concern for my welfare despite your own distress. All of it suggests a character that would complement my own." "But you can't know if you could love me," Serafina pressed, "any more than I can know if I could love you." "No," Alexander agreed, "but I can know that I already respect you, enjoy your company, and find myself protective of your happiness. Those seem like solid foundations upon which love might build." His honesty was both comforting and challenging. Marriage to Alexander would be a leap of faith, but it would be a leap taken with someone who valued truth above flattery. "There's something else," Alexander continued, his expression growing more serious. "Something I should have told you yesterday, but the circumstances didn't allow for full explanations." Serafina felt a chill of apprehension. "What is it?" "My military assignment to the Bavarian border is not merely defensive positioning. Intelligence suggests that Prussian forces are preparing for a spring offensive, and my regiment will likely be among the first to face enemy action." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Marriage to Alexander would not just mean navigating court society and building a partnership. It would mean facing the very real possibility of widowhood before their relationship had time to develop. "How certain is the conflict?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Certain enough that I would be failing in my duty if I didn't warn you," Alexander replied. "War is always uncertain, but my experience suggests that this particular storm is unlikely to pass without bloodshed." Serafina rose and moved to the window, staring out at the winter landscape that had nearly claimed her life. The irony was bitter. She had escaped one form of imprisonment only to consider binding herself to a man who might be taken from her by forces beyond their control. "Are you withdrawing your proposal?" she asked quietly. "I'm ensuring that you have all the information necessary to make an informed decision," Alexander replied. "I won't have you enter marriage under false pretenses about what the future might hold." His consideration for her feelings, even at the cost of his own interests, confirmed what Serafina had already begun to suspect, that Alexander Thornfield was a man worthy of the risk she was contemplating. "Yesterday," she said, turning back to face him, "when the ice gave way, I thought my story had reached its end. I was prepared to die rather than submit to Count Victor's demands. And now I realize that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise." Serafina moved closer to him, her decision crystallizing with each word. "Alexander, I cannot promise that I will love you, but I can promise that I will try. I cannot promise that our marriage will be easy, but I can promise that it will be honest." Alexander rose to meet her, hope beginning to kindle in his green eyes. "Are you accepting my proposal?" "I'm accepting the possibility of a future that neither of us can fully predict, but both of us are willing to work toward," Serafina replied. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." The kiss that sealed their engagement was gentle but electric, a promise of passion that might develop alongside partnership. As Alexander's arms came around her, Serafina felt the same security she had experienced when he pulled her from the frozen river, the certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would not face them alone. Their moment of private celebration was interrupted by urgent voices outside, followed by a sharp rap on the door. "Your Highness," Sergeant Major Kraus called. "Field Marshal's compliments, but you're needed immediately. There's been a development." Alexander and Serafina exchanged glances, both recognizing that their brief respite from crisis had ended. Whatever development required the Field Marshal's immediate attention was unlikely to be good news. They found the Field Marshal in heated discussion with a courier who bore the distinctive uniform of the Imperial Diplomatic Corps. Maps were spread across his campaign table, and his expression was grim with concern. "Ah, Prince Alexander, Lady Ashford," the Field Marshal said, looking up as they entered. "Your timing is fortuitous, as this news affects both of you." "What news?" Alexander asked, his military training making him immediately alert to potential threats. "Count Victor has escaped during transport to Vienna," the Field Marshal announced. "He overpowered his guards 20 miles from here and disappeared into the mountains. We have reason to believe he's headed for the Prussian border, where his cousin commands a regiment." The revelation struck like lightning. Count Victor was not only free, but potentially allying himself with Austria's enemies, a development that would make him infinitely more dangerous to both Serafina and the empire she was about to join through marriage. "How long ago?" Alexander demanded. 6 hours. Long enough for him to have significant lead on any pursuit. The Field Marshal's expression was grave. "Prince Alexander, I'm ordering your immediate departure for the frontier. Your regiment needs to be warned about potential security breaches, and Count Victor's knowledge of our defensive positions makes him a significant intelligence threat." Serafina felt her heart sink. The war that had been a distant possibility was suddenly an immediate reality, and the husband she had just agreed to marry was being called away before their wedding could even take place. "What about Lady Ashford?" Alexander asked, his concern for her safety evident. "She'll travel under heavy guard to Vienna, where she'll be safe until the situation stabilizes," the Field Marshal replied. "No," Serafina said quietly but firmly. If we're to be married, then we face whatever comes next together. Both men stared at her in surprise. Lady Ashford, the field marshal protested, the frontier is no place for the wife of a regimental commander, Serafina interrupted. I think you'll find that military wives have been following their husbands to war for centuries. Alexander looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Serafina, the dangers are no greater than those I've already survived, she replied. Yesterday I fell through ice and was rescued by a prince. Today I'm going to marry that prince and follow him to war. I refuse to be separated from you before we've had a chance to discover what we might become together. The declaration was both romantic and practical, born of the realization that their love would be forged in crisis, or not at all. As Alexander took her hand in his, Serafina knew that their real adventure was only just beginning. The wedding ceremony took place that very afternoon in the ancient chapel of Königswald, hastily arranged but beautiful in its simplicity. Field Marshal von Habsburg had used his considerable influence to summon a chaplain and gather the necessary witnesses, understanding that exceptional circumstances required exceptional measures. Serafina stood before the altar, wearing a gown of deep blue silk that had belonged to the village priest's late wife, a woman who, according to local legend, had also married in haste during wartime and lived to celebrate 50 years of happiness with her soldier husband. The dress had been altered by the skilled hands of village women who declared themselves honored to prepare a future princess for her wedding. Prince Alexander wore his dress uniform, the deep green and gold of the Imperial Guard, making him look every inch the military hero that circumstances were demanding he become. His bandaged hands, still healing from his desperate battle with the frozen river, served as a visible reminder of the courage and determination that had brought them together. Do you, Serafina Ashford, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold through war and peace, through danger and safety, until death do you part? The chaplain intoned, his voice carrying special weight, given the uncertainties that lay ahead. I do, Serafina replied clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the small chapel where villagers and soldiers had gathered to witness the extraordinary union. Do you, Alexander Thornfield, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and protect, to cherish and honor, through whatever trials may come, until death do you part? I do, Alexander said, his green eyes never leaving Serafina's face as he made the vow that bound their lives together. The ring that sealed their marriage was Alexander's own signet ring, hastily resized by the village blacksmith to fit Serafina's finger. It was a temporary solution that would be replaced by proper rings when circumstances allowed, but the symbolism was profound. She now bore his name, his protection, and his promise of devotion. By the power vested in me by God and the imperial crown, I now pronounce you husband and wife, the chaplain declared. Prince Alexander, you may kiss your bride. The kiss that followed was witnessed by Field Marshal von Habsburg, Sergeant Major Kraus, and a chapel full of people who understood they were witnessing something remarkable, a love story born of crisis and sealed by mutual choice rather than family arrangement. As the chapel bells rang out across the snow-covered village, messengers were already riding toward Vienna, with news of the marriage that would make Lady Serafina Ashford into Princess Alexander Thornfield, with all the rights and protections such a title conveyed. The wedding breakfast was a military affair, held in the common room of the village inn where Serafina had nearly died just 2 days earlier. The contrast between her circumstances then and now was almost impossible to comprehend, but the joy on the faces around her made it real. To Princess Alexander, Field Marshal von Habsburg offered in toast, raising his glass of the local wine. May her courage in marriage equal her courage in adversity. And to Prince Alexander, Serafina replied, surprising the assembled company by offering her own toast, who taught me that sometimes salvation comes in the form of someone willing to break through barriers to reach you. The traditional wedding festivities were necessarily brief. Within hours, the newly married couple would be departing for the frontier where war awaited, but the villagers of Königswald were determined to send them off with proper celebration. Mrs. Weber, the innkeeper's wife, approached Serafina with tears in her eyes and a small wrapped package. Your Highness, this was my grandmother's. She said it brought her luck through 3 wars and 7 children. I'd be honored if you'd carry it with you. Inside the package was a delicate lace handkerchief embroidered with forget-me-nots, the traditional symbol of true love and remembrance. Serafina accepted it with genuine gratitude, understanding that she was being welcomed into a community that valued loyalty and endurance above social pretension. As afternoon faded into evening, Alexander found his wife standing on the inn's balcony, gazing out at the mountains that lay between them and the frontier where their future would be decided. "Regrets already?" he asked, joining her at the railing. "Quite the opposite," Serafina replied, leaning into his warmth. "I was thinking how strange it is that 3 days ago I was a prisoner, yesterday I was drowning, and today I'm a princess married to the most honorable man I've ever met. You realize," Alexander said quietly, "that tomorrow brings uncertainties that could change everything. War has a way of reshaping even the best-laid plans. Then we'll adapt as needed," Serafina replied with newfound confidence. "I've learned that survival isn't about avoiding change, it's about embracing it with grace and courage." Alexander marveled at the transformation in the woman he had married. The frightened refugee he had pulled from the river had become a poised and determined partner, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. Her strength gave him hope that their hasty marriage might indeed develop into something profound and lasting. "There's something I need to tell you," Alexander said, his expression growing serious. "Before we reach the frontier and everything becomes about military necessity." "What is it?" "What began as a practical arrangement has become something else entirely for me," Alexander admitted. "I know it's too soon to speak of love, but I find myself caring for you in ways that go far beyond duty or convenience." Serafina turned to face him fully, her blue eyes reflecting the lamplight from the windows below. "Alexander, when you pulled me from that river, you saved more than my life. You gave me hope for a future I thought was lost forever. Whatever develops between us, I want you to know that marrying you was the easiest decision I've ever made." Their second kiss as husband and wife was longer and more passionate than the first, a promise of the intimacy that would grow alongside their partnership. As they stood together on the balcony overlooking the village that had witnessed their wedding, both felt the rightness of the choice they had made. The morning brought departure preparations and the organized chaos of a military unit preparing for rapid movement. Serafina had been provided with appropriate traveling clothes and a sturdy horse, along with a pair of pistols that Alexander insisted she learn to use before they reached potentially hostile territory. "Remember," Sergeant Major Krauss instructed as he helped her adjust her weapon holster, "the frontier is no place for half measures. If you have to draw those pistols, use them without hesitation." "I understand," Serafina replied, surprised by how natural the weapons felt in her hands. Perhaps the courage that had carried her through the past few days extended to areas she had never explored. As their small party, Prince Alexander, Princess Serafina, Sergeant Major Krauss, and an escort of 12 Imperial Guards rode out of Königswald toward an uncertain destiny, the village bells rang out in farewell. Behind them lay safety and comfort. Ahead lay war and danger. But riding beside Alexander as his wife and equal partner, Serafina felt none of the fear that such prospects should have inspired. Instead, she felt the exhilaration of someone who had discovered that love, even love in its earliest stages, was the most powerful armor against whatever storms life might bring. Count Victor von Ravenstein might have escaped to plot revenge from beyond the border, and Prussian forces might be gathering for invasion, but Princess Alexander Thornfield rode toward the future with absolute confidence that she and her husband would face whatever came next together. The woman who had fallen through the frozen river had been rescued in ways she was only beginning to understand, and the prince who had broken through the ice to save her had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories were won not on battlefields, but in the simple act of choosing to trust another person with one's heart. Their real adventure was just beginning, but they would meet it as partners, equals, and two people who had learned that the best love stories often began with someone willing to break down barriers to reach the person they were meant to love. 3 years later, Princess Serafina stood on the ramparts of Fort Königstein, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose as the last of winter's snow began to yield to spring's promise. The fortress had become her home during the border wars, a place where she had learned to balance the roles of military wife, field hospital administrator, and diplomatic liaison between the Austrian forces and the local population. In the valley below, the encampment of the Imperial Guard stretched out in orderly precision, a temporary city that had become permanent as the conflict with Prussia evolved from border skirmish into prolonged campaign. The war that everyone had expected to end quickly had instead revealed the changing nature of European politics, requiring new strategies and unexpected alliances. "Still can't sleep past dawn," Alexander's voice came from behind her, warm with the affectionate teasing that had become one of the hallmarks of their marriage. "Old habits," Serafina replied, turning to accept his embrace as he joined her at the stone barrier. "Besides, someone needs to witness the daily miracle of the sun deciding to rise despite everything we humans do to discourage it." Alexander laughed, the sound rich with the happiness that had grown between them over months of shared challenges and small triumphs. The practical arrangement that had begun their marriage had indeed developed into the deep love they had both hoped for, forged in the crucible of war, but tempered by moments of peace and discovery. "The courier from Vienna arrived during the night," Alexander said, producing an official dispatch from his coat. "The Emperor has approved your proposal for the civilian relief program. You're being granted an official budget and authority to coordinate with the Red Cross." Serafina accepted the document, with hands that no longer trembled with uncertainty. The work she had begun organizing medical care for wounded soldiers had expanded into a comprehensive program for assisting displaced civilian populations throughout the border region. Her linguistic skills and diplomatic training had proven invaluable in negotiating with local leaders and foreign relief organizations. "Princess Serafina von Habsburg-Thornfield, Imperial Commissioner for Civilian Relief," she read from the formal appointment letter. "It sounds rather grand for someone who started as a refugee herself. It sounds accurate for someone who has saved more lives than most generals," Alexander corrected, with obvious pride in his wife's accomplishments. The past 3 years had transformed them both in ways neither had anticipated. Alexander's military reputation had grown with each successful campaign, earning him promotion to full general and recognition as one of the Empire's most capable field commanders. But it was Serafina's work that had captured the imagination of the court and the people, turning her into a symbol of how personal suffering could be transformed into service to others. "Any word on Count Victor's latest schemes?" Serafina asked, though the question carried more curiosity than fear. "Intelligence suggests he's been assigned to staff duty in Berlin," Alexander replied with satisfaction. "Apparently his Prussian patrons have concluded that his talents are better suited to pushing papers than leading men. His inside knowledge of our defensive positions proved less valuable than he had hoped. Count Victor's alliance with the enemy had indeed proven problematic, but not in the ways anyone had expected. His bitter obsession with reclaiming Serafina had led him to provide increasingly unreliable intelligence to his Prussian allies, driven more by personal vendetta than military objectives. Eventually, his new masters had realized that his emotional instability made him a liability rather than an asset. "I almost feel sorry for him," Serafina said, though her tone suggested such sympathy was limited. "He made his choices," Alexander replied firmly, "just as we made ours." A commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention to the arrival of a familiar figure, Field Marshal von Habsburg, now showing more grey in his hair, but still carrying himself with the authority that had made him legendary. His presence at the frontier could only mean important news from the capital. They met him in the fortress's great hall, where maps covered every table and the business of war continued around the clock. But the Field Marshal's expression suggested that his news was more personal than military. "Your Highnesses," he greeted them with genuine warmth, having become something of a surrogate father to both during their marriage. "I bring congratulations from their Imperial Majesties, and news that will interest you both." "Congratulations for what?" Serafina asked, puzzled. "For the announcement that will be published in tomorrow's Imperial Gazette," the Field Marshal replied with a smile. "Prince Alexander is being recalled to Vienna to assume command of the Imperial Guard, and Princess Serafina is being appointed as Imperial Director of International Relief Operations." The news struck them both speechless. Command of the Imperial Guard was one of the highest honors in the military hierarchy, while Serafina's appointment represented official recognition of work that had begun as personal initiative. "The war?" Alexander asked, his first thought for the men he would be leaving behind. "Is stabilizing through diplomatic channels that owe much to your wife's humanitarian efforts," the Field Marshal explained. "It seems that Princess Serafina's work with civilian populations has created goodwill that traditional diplomacy could not achieve. The Prussian government is interested in negotiating from strength rather than continuing a conflict that has become costly for all parties." "You're saying that medical supplies and food distribution accomplished what armies could not?" Serafina asked, hardly daring to believe it. I'm saying that sometimes the most effective warfare is conducted by those who refuse to see enemies as anything less than human, the Field Marshal replied. Your refusal to distinguish between Austrian and Prussian civilians in need of aid has created moral pressure that politicians find difficult to ignore. The irony was profound. Serafina's work helping victims of war had become a path to ending that same war. Her insistence on treating suffering as a universal human problem rather than a political one had created the foundation for peace. When do we leave for Vienna? Alexander asked, though his expression suggested mixed feelings about abandoning frontier life. Within the month, the Field Marshal replied. Long enough to ensure proper transition of your command, but soon enough to take up your new duties before the Emperor's birthday celebrations in June. As they discussed the practical details of their transfer to the capital, Serafina reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. The terrified woman who had fallen through the frozen river had become a recognized authority on international humanitarian law, while the military officer who had rescued her had been elevated to one of the highest positions in the empire. That evening, as they walked together through the fortress gardens that Serafina had created from what had once been a bare courtyard, Alexander voiced the question that both of them were considering. Are you ready to return to court life? He asked. After 3 years of relative freedom on the frontier, I'm ready for whatever comes next, Serafina replied, echoing words she had spoken during their courtship. Though I confess, I'll miss the simplicity of life here. Simplicity? Alexander laughed. You've been coordinating relief efforts across 3 countries, negotiating with foreign governments, and running the most effective medical program in military history. If that's simplicity, I hate to imagine what complexity looks like. The complexity will be remembering how to navigate court politics after 3 years of dealing with people who say what they mean, Serafina replied with a smile. Though I suspect our experiences here have prepared us for whatever Vienna can offer. They paused beside the fountain that served as the garden's centerpiece, its gentle splash providing peaceful counterpoint to the distant sounds of military routine. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and the air carried the promise of spring and new beginnings. Do you ever think about how different our lives would have been if I hadn't happened to be riding past that river 3 years ago? Alexander asked. Never, Serafina replied immediately. I think we were always meant to find each other. If not at that river, then somewhere else in some other crisis that required your courage and my stubbornness to resolve. Alexander pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side after 3 years of learning each other's rhythms and preferences. Their marriage had become everything they had hoped for and more, a true partnership that had made both of them stronger and more effective than either could have been alone. I love you, he said, words that had become their daily affirmation. And I love you, Serafina replied, standing on her toes to kiss him softly. Today, tomorrow, and for all the adventures we have yet to discover together. As they stood together in the garden they had created from nothing, surrounded by the fortress that had become their home, and the work that had become their shared mission, both knew that their love story was far from over. Vienna would bring new challenges and opportunities, but they would meet them as they had met everything else, together, as equal partners who had learned that the strongest marriages were built not just on love, but on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the willingness to break through any barrier to reach each other. The woman who had fallen through the frozen river had indeed been rescued, but the prince who had broken the ice to save her had discovered that sometimes salvation worked both ways. In giving Serafina a new life, Alexander had found his own purpose, transformed from mere duty into something approaching destiny. Their real adventure was just beginning, but they would meet it as they had met everything else, with courage, intelligence, and the absolute certainty that whatever storms might come, they would weather them together. Before you go, tap the like button and subscribe for new stories every week.